Hey, Vince McMahon, it's time for this week's Stick to Wrestling podcast.
Oh, no, give me a break.
Oh, brother. Sweet Caroline, good times never seem so good, but never better than we listen to the Stick to Wrestling podcast. Hello, everyone. My name is John McAdam. This is Stick to Wrestling, a classic wrestling podcast where if you give us 60 minutes, perhaps indeed, we'll give you a wicked good and raw-boned podcast. I invite all of you to join our Facebook group. It's just called Stick to Wrestling. We have all kinds of cool conversations, results, photos of old wrestling pictures, and they let me have a podcast. But yeah, that's what we have. You are invited. Also, follow me on Twitter. It strokes my ego when people follow me, when I get new followers. Just search John McAdam and follow the guy who has the Stick to Wrestling avatar as his whatever it is, the thing there. I am so not together right now, and I don't know why. I've had all kinds of time to get ready for this. Quick note before we get started, we are in the middle of a thunderstorm where I'm at, where we're recording. So if you hear rain smacking around the background, that's what it is. If you hear a boom, it's thunder. I hope my Wi-Fi doesn't get wonky. But with that, another reason to join the Facebook group is we took questions from the group for this show, very specific, because my guest and I both started watching wrestling right around the same time, 1976, and we're going to talk about that year, guided through your questions. There was a tag team in 1976, Dennis Condrey and Phil Hickerson, who were a great team, calling themselves the Bicentennial Kings. We are the other Bicentennial Kings, myself and my guest, Steve Generelli. Steve, thanks for coming back.
Hey, John, it's great to be back after a lengthy absence, as they like to say on WWF TV 100 years ago. And it's great to be back with our Stick to Wrestling Nation and all of their questions.
Steve, if you wanted the hair to stick up on my arms, all Vince McMahon would have to say is, and returning after a lengthy absence, I would just be like, oh, and I'd be like, who is it? Or, making his WWF debut. I mean, talk about like your little kid high. That was great for me.
No, those were the days, and it's such a simple time. I mean, we're just 1 hour of wrestling a week, and not too many matches in that hour, and a handful of interviews, and we were happy as clams.
One thing we were discussing on the Facebook group is I put up results from an AWA show, and someone said, wow, there are other places where people would complain about, there were 3 like DQ, count out, draw, whatever finishes. And people, there are some people who complain about that. I would go to a WWF show in 81, 82, whenever, and there would be, I would list results. You'd have a DQ, count out, whatever. We didn't care. There was not a whisper of complaint in the car or the van or whatever on the way home about, oh no, there were not a lot of clean finishes. As you said, it was a simpler time.
Now that leads me to ask you this question, because I don't know if you've ever answered this on the show before. I don't think we've ever had this conversation before. Do you remember the first live show you attended? And if so, what do you remember about it?
Well, I have discussed this, but it has been a little while. The first show I saw, I believe, was December 10th, 1976 in North Attleboro, Massachusetts. The main event was kind of a dream match for me, and everyone get ready to laugh. It was the Masked Executioners versus Chief Jay Strongbow and Billy White Wolf. And I was very surprised. Somehow, I was very surprised that Captain Lou Albano did not make the pilgrimage to North Attleboro, Massachusetts. And number 2 on the undercard of that show was Bruiser Brody against no less than Jose Gonzalez.
Wow. I do remember you mentioning that match, not the main event match, but that was really, other than Bruno's biggest feuds that year, the Indians against the Executioners was a really hot feud for the WWWF.
It really was, and it kind of, introduced me to what the WWF was going to be about when it came to tag teams, because they really dragged that feud out. I mean, it started in the spring, and here we are in December, and it's still going on, and the Executioners never even lost the tag team titles. They had them stripped away when there were shenanigans, and then they have this tournament in like late '76, and it was like I'm like 13 years old. I'm in 6th grade, so I'm 12 years old. Never mind. And they're talking about they have a jobber team wrestling the Executioners in this tournament. And Vince McMahon is like, oh, and this team is a late entry into the tournament. I'm like, do these people know how tournaments work? Come on.
I'll never forget that, because that was the same time where Monsoon came out, representing the WWF officials. And he said, oh, in the semifinals, the team of Bruiser and the Sheik lost to, and he was just mentioning these guys from other promotions that weren't even in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. So those were exciting times.
I just watched by the time we take our first question, the hour will be up. I was watching Monsoon doing commentary from '85. This was just today. And he's talking about like how the winner gets the entire share of the purse money and the loser doesn't get any of it. And if it's a draw, they get 50-50. I'm like, what is this guy yammering about, for God's sake?
Yeah, and people go on about he was the greatest thing of their childhood. Give me a break.
Oh, I don't want to say I never liked Monsoon. I'm sure I liked him when I was way younger, but when he was on primetime wrestling or whatever, I could not stand the guy. And I guess, that was me being in my late teens, early 20s versus me being, 10 or 11.
Well, I think at least when Jesse showed up and when Bobby the Brain showed up, they actually made him palatable. Without those two guys, he would have been the pits.
I thought he was great with Jesse. He was fine with Heenan when they were actually doing matches, but I did not like Gorilla Monsoon on the primetime wrestling set. He was like your grumpy old uncle. Oh, I'll kick you out of here. Oh.
I actually liked him in that. I didn't really care for him much, like doing challenge or those, but that's just my personal preference. But hey, we've got a whole bunch of questions we better get to.
Well, I want to know your first wrestling card, and I'm going to guess it was in Binghamton, and I'm going to guess it was 1981.
Well, those are good guesses. It was Binghamton in 1977. So the first card was, it was just interesting going into the building because I'd gone there we'd seen minor league hockey for, I probably went to like, 40 games every year, and you're used to the hockey setup, and you're seeing, and this was the NAHL. This was the league with Goldie Goldthorpe and tons of fighting. It was kind of like the league that Slapshot was based on. And so you're used to hockey, but when I walked in that building and I bought my souvenirs, and which were just the programs in black and white 8x10s, and then I walked through the center to just look at the ring. I was just in awe just looking at the ring in the center of this building. And I think the first show only probably drew and this is the first WWWF show in that town in many a year. I think it probably only drew like 1,400 fans. They would do a lot better in the years to come. But the main event was a double main event of Strongbow against Von Raschke and Stasiak against Putski, or maybe the reverse of those two. And it was okay. Just to see the prelims. I think the first match may have been like Don Serrano against Steve King or something to that effect. You knew full well from being at the cards, how full well those matches were terrible, those prelim matches. But we, the cards that followed after that, we saw Billy Graham against Strongbow a few times, and those were atrocious matches, like 3 to 4 minutes tops, and Strongbow completely dominating. But hey, I got the memory of seeing Billy Graham in almost his prime.
I did not get to see Superstar Billy Graham in his prime. I got to see Kung Fu Superstar Billy Graham, but that was it. And he defended against Strongbow in North Attleboro. The Jack Ritchie Sports Arena was like literally a 1 mile walk from where I lived. I actually checked on, I don't know, the internet, whatever website tells you this, and it says it was 1.1 miles.
Well, you were a future valedictorian, and you had your highest standards you had to follow. So I understand completely.
Ah, there you go. All right, we are going to talk about 1986. We're not lying to you this time. We took a question. We took two similar questions. One is from Mark Hertwick. If Bruno is unable, I like the way Bruno has one name, and we totally know who we're talking about. Is unable to return from his broken neck. For the Showdown at Shea in 1976, who from the WWF are you booking for the main event to pair with the Ali Enoki closed circuit fight from Japan? And number two, if Bruno does not come back from the broken neck, does the WWF survive? Steve, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, for Mark's question, I would say my answer is similar to what would happen if Andre doesn't show up for WrestleMania 3. No, that's not going to happen. Andre is going to show up for WrestleMania 3,
Right.
and Bruno is going to show up for this event too. He meant too much. The Enoki thing was a complete flop. It would have been a huge bomb in New York without this Bruno match, so it had to happen. As to the similar question, would the WWF have died if Bruno didn't come back? No, I don't think so. It wouldn't have been the best thing. I mean, he definitely needed a send off of some sort. He couldn't just be, end of career, end of everything. They would have somehow found a way to get a replacement, like even a Billy Graham heel replacement, and eventually a Backlund. But I don't see any world where Bruno doesn't have the proper send off or proper transition into the next phase of his career.
Well, I looked at it this way. Okay, the Andre thing, I get the similarity, but Bruno legitimately broke his neck or fractured his neck. I think it was April 26, 1976. And Steve, have you ever seen the footage of that?
I actually watched that match on HBO Live, the Bruno Hansen match, and
oh wow.
I was such a naive young fan. I ran down the stairs and put on the Bill Mazer and the New York sports on the TV, thinking that they were talking about Bruno's broken neck, but they never mentioned it. Go figure.
Oh yeah, really? Well, I mean, if you have, I saw it right after Bruno died. They put out a special on what was then WWE Network, and they showed it. I think they showed it for the first time. You wonder how Bruno didn't get killed. I mean, Stan dropped him right on the top of his head like a spike. It was insane. So I took the question as, what if Bruno really, this happens April 26th. What if he really, truly can't get in the ring on, June 26th, I think it was. What if he really, truly can't walk? What I would have done was I would have said, okay, we're having a tournament for the WWF Championship, a 4-man tournament so that everyone in the promotion doesn't have to do a job. I would have done Superstar Billy Graham, Stan Hansen, Ivan Putski. I would have brought back Pedro Morales if there was any other way. Otherwise, Bobo Brazil. And I would have had Superstar Billy Graham win the tournament. So 1977 arrives a year early. So then when Bruno is finally ready to come back, you've got the Revenge versus Stan Hansen matches. Those are going to draw. And then B, you've got the, hey, I'm going after the championship, I never lost storyline. So that's how I took the question. Like, what if Bruno really couldn't come back after 2 months?
I really like your answer. That's outstanding. That would have been a huge box office with those two attractions. Awesome answer, John.
Well, thank you very much. And if Bruno doesn't come back, does the WWF survive? I know Bruno has claimed, and I believe him, that Vince Sr. told him, if you don't wrestle on June 26th, I'm going to go out of business. So that's what kind of brought Bruno into the ring. Whether or not that's true, I doubt it, because here's why. You have the WWF at the time, which had a monopoly on New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, all of the cities in the Northeast and all places in between, places like Binghamton, places like Nashville, New Hampshire, that, draws for wrestling. So and I know Vince Sr. lost big money on the Ali Enoki thing, but, we wouldn't have just tuned in to Channel 9 or Channel 56 when it's wrestling time and we see they're running an old movie or something like that, the WWF would have survived. Worst case scenario, someone buys the promotion from Vince Sr. More likely scenario, if he really takes a hit on this, you bring in an investor, you bring in outside money, and you have the person either buy a piece of the promotion or you use the promotion as collateral on a loan. There's no way the WWF goes under. And like I said, I know it's been discussed, but if you take a step back and you look at it, that ain't happening.
No, I agree completely. They had despite McMahon Senior liking to go to the racetrack and all that stuff, they had money in the bank. Right. They weren't hurting. They had money in the bank. But anyhow, I do have another question here, and this one is from John Ware. He asks, kind of 1976, was Ali a fan before he got involved in wrestling, or was it strictly personal promotion for him?
What do you think, Steve?
I've heard that he was a Blassie fan growing up, and whether it was his memory going bad or the Parkinson's or whatever, I think years later that may have changed to Gorgeous George was his influence. It may have been Blassie, but obviously from what he did in wrestling, the stuff. Setting up this thing with Monsoon, you could tell he was enjoying it. He let himself go up for the airplane spin. He kind of looked like a dummy getting slammed by Monsoon, and I think he was really enjoying his time in wrestling.
I agree. I've always heard, I haven't read his autobiography, which is kind of a mistake on my part, but I've always heard he was a big fan, that he loved Gorgeous George, that he borrowed a lot of his personal style from wrestling in general. I mean, you can tell he was influenced by it. So I believe he grew up a fan. And, wrestling, even before Jarrett in Louisville, I mean, wrestling was big in Louisville. So, I think Dick the Bruiser ran it back in the day.
Yeah, and he he did lots of different promotions in wrestling over the years. He maybe did WrestleMania 1. He did didn't he do something in, I think, Louisiana with a promotion there, and of course WCW years later he did something with them. So he was really happy to get involved with wrestling.
I want to say it was 73 or 74 when he was on Wide World of Sports and he did a match with Buddy Wolf. And, of course, Howard Cosell has to ruin it. This is a farce. But, I mean, you're right. He was so involved in it that you think he had to want to be, especially, he's the most famous person in the world and he's farting around with Buddy Wolf on Wide World of Sports.
Yeah, and that actually was tied in with this promotion for the Ali thing. I guess Vince was there too, and they thought that this was going to catch on. And I give them credit; they were thinking outside the box. They thought this mixed martial arts thing would catch on, but it just wasn't meant to be.
All right, we have two more similar questions about the Ali Inoki fight. One is from Brian Garunto. I remember watching the Ali Monsoon get together on TV, but did it receive any mainstream media attention? That was number one. And let me answer that. It did not. It got, if I recall correctly, both his involvement on WWF TV and his match against Enoki got tiny little features in Sports Illustrated, like not even a feature, just like a quarter of a page, maybe not even. I mean, Steve, do you remember anything like mainstream coming out of this? I totally don't remember anything in the sporting news. I don't remember anything like, watching sports on the news, whatever.
No, I really don't either. I think that this was just a little bit before the time where you had TV shows like PM Magazine and those popular type of shows where, and of course, ESPN was many, many years away. So the kind of the Sports Center moment was just a gleam in Bill Simmons' eye, I guess.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I remember it getting virtually no coverage. And Brian also mentions he is still amazed that Ali let himself get handled like that. And to this, as soon as I figured out what was going on in wrestling, I thought the same thing. I mean, for those who haven't seen it, Gorilla Monsoon is at ringside. Muhammad Ali is at ringside. Gorilla Monsoon is about to wrestle Baron Mikhail Cicluna. Ali gets in the ring, and Gorilla Monsoon ragdolls the guy. He just like drops him, and then he picks him up and puts him in an airplane spin, and Ali is helpless. And then Monsoon goes out and to be interviewed by Vince McMahon, and he's gloating about it. I could have done anything I wanted with that guy. I'm just, to this day, I'm shocked Ali did that. I mean, he made himself look so bad.
It was a hilarious moment. I mean, if you're just watching it, or I could just imagine somebody that had no idea what wrestling was, and they just landed on this channel and they see Ali in the ring getting tossed around by this 400-pound Gorilla Monsoon. It was just had it been in that era of Sports Center, it would have been all over. Or the era of social media that we're living in now, it would have been on every website, on every newspaper, everything.
Yeah, that great shoot move, the airplane spin. And let me see. And David Ferguson asks, any thoughts on Ali versus Inoki? Steve, have you ever seen the match?
I've seen clips of it over the years. I guess I never really wanted to make myself suffer so much to really endure the entire match. But I mean, my idea of their match together is kind of akin to, hey, I run Paramount Pictures. Let's have a movie with Marlon Brando. Let's also get Jack Nicholson. But we have no script, but these guys are going to show up on Saturday, and we're going to start filming, and we'll see what happens. And I bet you in 6 months we'll have the best movie you'll ever see. I mean, it doesn't work like that. You have to have something. You have to have a script to make a movie. You have to have a scenario to make a wrestling match, or in this case, a mixed martial arts match, to have them say, hey, we're going to be shooters. I'm going to be on my back the whole time. You're going to be trying to punch me, but I'm never going to be within your airspace. I mean, it's just made for the most asinine fight of all time.
Okay, a little background. I got the fight. Was one of the first things I got when I started trading tapes in 1987. And wow. I saw it. I didn't know what to expect. And like a half an hour into it, I'm like, I got through it, but I was like, I can't stand this. This is so boring. This is awful. And then I watched it again, maybe over 20 years ago, after UFC became a thing. And I grew to appreciate it because
really.
Yeah, Steve, they did have a script. The script was going to be that Enoki was busted open, and Ali was going to be begging the ref, hey, stop the match. This guy's hit his hamburger. And as he was doing that, Enoki was going to give him an enziguri kick, knocking him out of the ring and getting him counted out. Now, if Ali did what he did with Monsoon, I don't see the problem with this, right? But as the match got closer, Ali didn't want to do a job. No one wanted to cancel this because Enoki had a lot of money invested in this as well. So they agreed to those rules, and they went by those rules. And as something, obviously Enoki's not going to sit there and trade punches with Muhammad Ali, for God's sake. So I thought what he did was a really good strategy. Now, is it an hour that I would recommend any of our listeners to invest in this? I would not. But I didn't think it was the worst thing in the world. I got what Enoki was doing, and this is going to sound like a strange thing to say. I think Enoki absolutely should have won the match on a decision.
Well, I do remember hearing that when they were discussing how the match was going to go, and they were trying to book an ending to the match, and that scenario that you described with the enziguri kick, and the fact that I think Enoki was going to do the major blade job. I think when the boxing people heard about the blading, they just lifted their hands up in the air and said, "We want no part of this." They just felt that was so beneath them. They couldn't do business with that, but I really enjoy hearing. Yeah, I really enjoy hearing your feedback, though, that you watched the match and did enjoy it somewhat. That's very interesting.
I mean, you think of all the crazy, sleazy stuff that went on in the 1970s boxing industry, and some wrestler cutting his head is going to be all right. Now that's where I'm drawing the line. I don't know about that, Steve.
Well, we'll have to leave that to the history books. Who knows?
Yeah, I actually bought the Ali versus Enoki book probably about 2 years ago, and I am one of those people who buys books and never reads them, but I will get around to it someday. Probably not. I'm lying. But anyway, Steve, it is your turn to pick a question.
All right. We have Les Takix, who is asking us, what was any promotion's biggest missed opportunity in 1976? And he asked us, could it be Bruno versus Andre?
I mean, my own take on it is you can't do Bruno versus Andre. You cannot do it. It makes no sense. Andre can't do a job and Bruno can't do a job, so you just don't make that match. I'm not even sure it would be something that the fans would want to see, to be honest with you.
I think the only one that was ever interested in that was Bruno. He seemed to have a fascination with that match. But after the of failure, somewhat, he was interested in it. But after the failure of the Bruno Morales match, Senior really never wanted to do another scientific match like that again. And it was good that they didn't, because like you said, if Bruno loses, it devalues him. If Andre loses, it devalues him. And to have a screw job ending or a draw wasn't the way they did things in New York, as far as usually they like to have a definitive winner in an important match, with the exception of that Morales-Bruno match. So
I would think that Bruno, if anything, would have learned his lesson from the Pedro Morales versus Bruno Sammartino match.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. Again, I don't think there could have been any winner in that match. What do you think, though, as far as maybe from another promotion? Was there a missed opportunity for maybe a different type of a dream match in another city?
I don't know about a match. I would say the biggest missed opportunity, and I will preface this by saying I know this is not how the NWA did business, and they did fine more or less in 1976 doing what they did, but Dusty Rhodes was on fire. And I don't think making him the NWA champion would have been the worst thing in the world. I think, he would have been a draw anywhere he went. You could have had it. It could have been relatively short term, like a 12, 18-month run. But, all you have to do is do what the WWF did with Hogan, do what the WWF was doing with Bruno Sammartino. Just feed him a heel every time he comes in.
That's a great idea. And I just wonder, why couldn't the NWA promoters have tried to do a Dusty on top somewhere for some length of time? I mean, why did it always have to be the formula of, bad guy champ with the chase and the bad guy putting over the local guy for 55 minutes and then the traditional ending? I don't know why they had to keep sticking with that formula.
Well, I mean, the one reason, and, there are other reasons that may have overcome this, but when the NWA champion went to Dallas, Fritz von Erich wanted the NWA champion, making him look good. He didn't want to set up heel of the month or heel of the 2 or 3 months, whatever. I think Eddie Graham liked the NWA champion coming in and going up against Dusty Rhodes. Mr. Wrestling 2 was the top guy in Georgia. So, you want to have Terry Funk or whoever against Mr. Wrestling 2. So I think that makes sense. But what may, have been bigger than that is, hey, Dusty was red hot in 76. He made money everywhere he went. So, like I said, what they did worked. So I'm not going to complain too much.
Sure. And you have a question for me now about the great 76.
Yeah, I do, and I'll actually answer it first. I'll give you a couple of seconds or whatever to think about what your answer might be. Last week's guest, Brad Breitzman, asked, how was Terry Funk booked as NWA champion? Was he a total tweener, or how was he used? Now, in 76, I didn't know this, but as time went on and I started buying back issues of the wrestling magazines, learning a little bit about history, Terry Funk really was the first 100% heel NWA champion, of course, excluding when he's defending the title in Amarillo or that territory. Gene Kiniski leaned towards the heel side, but not like as much as Terry Funk did. It was a complete departure from the Jack Briscoe, who was a babyface, but sometimes he'd get a little bit heelish in his matches. Dory Funk Jr., same thing. Lou Thez, same thing. So we're going way back here. And Terry was the first guy who he was 100% heel. Like I said, everywhere he went, there was no subtlety to it, and that's how he was booked. Do you have any thoughts on that, Steve?
Well, I do know that he was champion for I think about 14 months. And from what I've been told, compared to the prior NWA champions who had all been more like traditional wrestlers, he was just complete Terry Funk. He was the complete showman, and he would do his Terry Funk stuff in the matches. He would have crazy brawls, he would have crazy bumps, he would do insane things in the ring. And I think some fans that were, the insider fans or observer type fans, they might have felt it was a little bit too extreme or a little bit too over the top. But he definitely was a very untraditional NWA champion compared to the Pat O'Connors and the Kiniskis and Dory and Briscoe especially.
He was, and Terry Funk is one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. If you listen to this podcast, you know that. Terry Funk was considered an unsuccessful NWA champion compared to the previous ones. And I think, it might have been less, Terry Funk isn't a draw. I think we've seen that Terry Funk's a draw, and maybe more the way he was constantly used. They used him every promotion the way Ric Flair was used in Dallas. Like, clearly, Kerry Von Erich is better than this guy, but, well, the rules are the rules, and he gets to keep the championship. I mean, to me, that's why Terry didn't draw, not because Terry Funk couldn't draw.
Oh, no, he was just outstanding as he always is in the ring. And just like he was in the WWF about 10 years later, just the travel just got to him. I mean, it was insane travel. I mean, I looked up his year, and he would go to, a specific territory, wrestle like 4 or 5 different guys. With somebody really popular like Dusty, if he was in Florida, he'd wrestle Dusty maybe 2 or 3 times, but he really spread it out. He would wrestle, 3 or 4 different challengers during these 1-week stays and promotions. And it just was what it was. I mean, he got burned out from working so many dates, and by the time that Harley beat him in Toronto, beginning of '77, he was exhausted. He was grateful to give up the belt.
No, and so many guys wanted that championship, and Briscoe handed it back to them. He'd had enough, and then Terry, after only like 14 months, decided that he'd had enough, and which is a little bit of a surprise to me because if anyone knew what they were getting into, it was Terry Funk, because his brother had just been NWA champion. But, I mean, it wasn't the lifestyle for him. And good for him. He got out of it.
Yeah, and now looking back on it, I mean, I think a lot of the younger fans that only know Terry from ECW, they just don't realize what he did in the 70s and what he meant to the 70s. He was such an important wrestler in the 1970s.
And he was even a bigger star over in Japan. He was like a god in Japan. And I think he just retired once too many times there.
Yeah, definitely. He was really beloved over there. Now, I owe you a question here. I'm going to look for the right one.
All right. You know what? While you're doing that, I just want to throw in a quick thing. I remember when Terry Funk showed up in the WWF, I want to say summer of 1985. I was just like, wow, they're blowing the dust off Terry Funk. How old is this guy? And no, immediately, like the first thing he does is he hands his gear to Mel Phillips, and Mel Phillips, his arms are full, so he puts on Terry Funk's cowboy hat, and Terry Funk beats the crap out of him. And I was like, oh my God, I love this guy.
Yeah, it's funny. Here's a ridiculous wrestling trivia. Terry's first opponent in that match was Aldo Marino, and Aldo Marino would actually be Randy Savage's first opponent in the WWF right around the same time. So, and I think he was later known as Ricky Santana, but he was a good job guy. But yeah, Terry Funk was awesome. He was just great in everything he did.
We're getting way off the tracks. I remember JCP had Ricky Santana in 1988. And I was like, why are they not pushing this guy? Are they unaware that the United States has a Hispanic population?
Yeah, he was a good worker, definitely. And hey, I found a question that might be appropriate after the last one we just went over. This one is from Sonny Martinez. Sonny is asking, what was the perception of Harley Race in 1976? By that point, he'd only had the NWA World Championship for less than 2 months, and that was years before that. Was he viewed as a failure, or was it known that his best years were about to come?
Well, I am actually that was my next question that I was going to pick, and I'm actually glad Sonny asked that because I don't even think Sonny's dad was born by 1976. Never mind Sonny, but I saw him as, hey, he had the credit of being a former NWA champion. Yeah, it was kind of a short run. It was a short run by the standards of the time, but he won it, which to me means he could win it again. So, back then, once you have that status as former NWA champion, that's not something that's going away. And they didn't have, Tommy Rich runs back then either. And when Terry Funk, kind of merging the two conversations, when they put the title on Terry Funk, it was Terry barely got the nod over Harley Race. I remember having a conversation with Harry White and a couple other people about this like 30 years ago. It really could have gone either way. And when Terry 14 months later said, I've had enough of this, there wasn't even a conversation. Harley Race was getting the championship, and he held it for over 4 years with a couple of quickies thrown in.
Harley's another guy. His career is very comparable to Terry Funk. Just the incredible body of work and longevity. But as far as somebody that you're picking as the face of the NWA, I always kind of think like he is a guy that is in the background, like somebody that, hey, if we don't have anybody better, let's go with Harley. And it just seems like, to me at least, and maybe I'm completely wrong, the promoters of the NWA were looking for somebody a little more splashy the way Flair would end up being, or if Kerry had a prime that he could have really sunk his teeth into. Because Harley, a great worker in the ring, but he didn't have that personality, or I guess like the larger than life personality of a Dusty or a Flair. Great worker, no doubt about that, but and he had that real serious look. Maybe that was part of what sold him on the promoters. You could really believe that this guy was a champion and tough as nails, but he wasn't flashy like, say, Flair or Dusty was.
Definitely not. As far as look and personality, Harley was, he was dry paint. What can I tell you? Like you said, great worker. And here's the thing, too. When Race won the title in 77, by the time he lost it, 1981, the wrestling business had really changed. He was kind of bland for 77, but by the time 81 rolled around, at the time I was like, what is this? You're putting the most dull guy you could have out there. You might as well call him Bob Johnson or something like that. And, like I said, the wrestling business had changed, and I thought the NWA really took its sweet time changing along with it. And I just want to throw this in too. I get that Harley was reliable unless he was wrestling for Paul Bosch. I get that, he had great matches, that everyone liked him, that he was legit, but I thought they kept the title on him way too long.
Yeah, I agree completely. When the 1980, like you say, 80, 81, 82, and he's still really heavily in the championship mix, and he just started to look quite older than his real age was. I guess all the long nights driving and the 24 packs of beer and stuff really was catching up to him. But yeah, as Vince showed later on, when you have guys that look like Orndorff and Hogan and Tommy Rich, he didn't have a great body, but the youthful face and everything, that appealed to the young guys and girls that went to the matches. And unfortunately, or fortunately for Harley, he got to be champion probably a lot longer than he needed to be. So.
Yeah, I mean, and I read Harley Race's book, and I mean, taking a step back, when they put the title back on him in 1983, it was like the worst news I'd ever gotten. I was like, wait a minute, I'm still sick of this guy, right? And he's NWA champion again, and that was a significant change because it was almost like they were taking the NWA championship and using it to the benefit of one promotion and one promotion only, and that's the Mid-Atlantic, so they could have Starcade 83 with Flair winning it back. And, to me, that's kind of very backward in my opinion. But Harley Race in his book was like really bitter about losing the title at Starcade 83 for the last time, and that he felt like the NWA basically wiped their ass with him. And I couldn't disagree more. I thought Harley, he had the belt for 4 years, and then he had it again for another 6 months. What else can you ask for?
Yeah. Well, I guess I could, he's a man with great pride, and he should have that pride because what he did in the ring, I mean, I don't know, you couldn't count on one hand the guys that could work those kind of matches that he could, that had the durability that he had, the toughness that he had. And I've only talked to Dave Meltzer on the phone maybe like 2 or 3 times my whole life, but I talked to him briefly when Harley did that bump against Hogan in Memphis, and his insides got all torn apart. That terrible bump he took on Saturday Night Main Event. And Dave Meltzer, I could tell he was like touched. I mean, just his voice was like, his voice cracked, I think, just saying almost the fact that, Harley came close to death from that bump. And the fact that he stitched himself up and, made a comeback in the WWF. And then he, of course, went to WCW, became the manager for Vader. But the fact that he even wrestled Flair a few times on house shows for WCW in the early 90s. I mean, this guy just lived and breathed wrestling. And then, as you well know, went on to have his own school and had lots of good graduates that became good pros. But man, what a guy! I mean, just what a career! What a great wrestler you can be proud of.
I cannot emphasize enough that I was not bashing Harley Race at all when I was saying that stuff. And
no, I know, I know that.
Yeah, I mean, I remember hearing about the bump in Nashville before it aired on Saturday Night's Main Event. I heard about, the injury and how bad it was. And then I saw it, and I was like, what is he thinking? That was like a suicide bump. The guy,
he was just so tough. I mean, he continued with that match. He just kept working and working. Yes. But, he was phenomenal.
I mean, and plus he had that car wreck when he was like 16, 17, and, that almost knocked him out of wrestling. I always crack up when Gordon Soley would mention that car wreck and he'd go, but Harley Race has managed to wrestle more than half his adult life in the ring, like more than half his adult life. Oh, Gordon, take algebra. Jeez.
Oh, man. Well, I think you owe me a question now.
Okay. In your opinion, Dan Farron asked, what was the strongest roster in 1986?
Well, I actually looked at a few different promotions. It could be Florida. I mean, I've got the list in front of me here. I mean, it's like a who's who of wrestling. Billy Robinson, which our good friend here in Florida would like, Barry Rose. Young Ricky Steamboat was here. Young Paul Orndorff was here. Ray Stevens, Joe LeDuc, Dusty. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. The Carolinas had an incredible group, too. Ric Flair was there. Wahoo McDaniel. Malenko, the Andersons, Paul Jones, Mulligan, a young Dino Bravo, Tim Woods, Tony Atlas, Johnny Weaver. I mean, the WWF had, Bruno, arguably the most popular wrestler. You had Andre, you had Bobo Brazil, you had Superstar, you had Ivan Koloff, Hanson and Brody as youngsters and big threats, and of course Ken Patera. So, I mean, you could really just, toss a dime up in the air and do a pick. But I guess I'd probably go with Mid-Atlantic just because they had a huge, diverse group, and they were putting on great cards, high quality cards at the time.
I'm actually going with Mid-Atlantic by a pretty wide margin because even as a kid buying the magazines, I saw wrestler after wrestler in Mid-Atlantic that I considered major superstars at the time. Just like by me looking at them in a magazine made me say, oh, wow, this guy's a star. We're talking, guys who were there almost the entire year, like Wahoo McDaniel, Paul Jones, Ric Flair, Greg Valentine, Blackjack Mulligan. Steamboat hadn't gotten his first push yet. Tim Woods is Mr. Wrestling. Like most of those guys, I looked at and said, okay, I don't be surprised if I pick up a magazine at the drugstore, open it up, and see that a whole bunch of that roster has become NWA champion. So WWF, I think, is a close second. Like you said, they had Ernie Ladd, Superstar Billy Graham, Ivan Koloff, Ken Patera. A few of them are no-brainer Hall of Famers. And then, like you said, a young Hansen, a young Brody, Nikolai Volkov was impressive. And then you get the guys who. Ivan Putski, Bobo Brazil, those guys were still over. Strongbow came back. Guys who maybe wouldn't have been stars other places, but that doesn't matter. They were stars here.
Oh yeah, and I would also include Florida in the conversation. Florida had an amazing group of faces and heels with Dusty, the head of it, of course, and. I actually talked to George Shire briefly before the podcast just to get his take on 1976 and the AWA. He said it was a unique year over there just because Bockwinkel had won the AWA title off of Verne in late 75. So kind of like Billy Graham and WWWF in 77, for the first time, all the babyface challengers were having a heel champion to go against. So in the AWA, you had Bockwinkel defend against people like Larry Hennig and the Crusher and Peter Maivia and a lot of the local guys that were over in the AWA. So I wouldn't say the AWA was in the discussion of best talent, but definitely an exciting year with Bockwinkel in charge. And also representing the Heenan family was Duncombe and Lanza had a long-term hold on the tag team titles there. And, of course, the young high flyers were their top challengers.
That is a really good point that the AWA in 1976 almost got turned upside down because it was a promotion we were used to seeing the heels chasing after Verne. Now we've got the complete mirror image of the baby faces chasing Nick Bockwinkel.
Yeah, George felt as a longtime fan that he felt that this was quite refreshing, and he said that there wasn't really any major turnover in the roster that year, but just the fact that they could kind of change their program completely made it exciting. So those are fun times to hear about.
Definitely. Yeah, that was a really good point. Before I throw out my next question, Steve, I just looked at the clock and I was like, you got to be kidding me. This 45 minutes has flown by. I've only got 15 minutes left. I'm going to make the best of it, doggone it. All right, Denny Bentley asks, had the plane crash not happened in Mid-Atlantic in 1975 and Johnny Valentine was still the main heel, do you think Ric Flair would have risen as fast as he did?
I personally think on that he it did help speed him along a little bit, but I think that promotion was kind of advanced in that they did like to push the younger guys. And I know after the terrible accident that occurred, Billy Graham even was brought in temporarily to the Carolinas, and he worked as a top heel briefly. And of course, Flair, they realized they had something with him, and he caught on. And same with Greg Valentine, became a big Mid-Atlantic star shortly thereafter. And yeah, I think had the accident not occurred, I think Johnny Valentine would have hopefully been on top for a few more years. And that was a huge loss to wrestling since he was so phenomenal. But yeah, the young guys would have got their push. They would have had their day in the sun, maybe just a little bit later down the road.
All right, a couple of things I wanted to talk about. I mean, this is wrestling in 1975. You've got Tim Woods, good guy, and Johnny Valentine, bad guy, riding in the same plane. And in order to protect the business, Tim Woods, who has just been in a plane crash, did not, and he had broken ribs. I've had bruised ribs. Bruised ribs are brutal. I can only imagine what broken ribs must be like trying to travel and wrestle. I mean, it's incredible, but that's what they did to protect the business. I mean, that's number one, but number two, again, I want to emphasize, he was just in a plane crash, for God's sake. If I was in a plane crash, I wasn't hurt, I'd be so flipped out I wouldn't be able to wrestle for a few weeks. But secondly, I was told by someone who knew that they were on the cusp of turning Johnny Valentine babyface. And he did say on the cusp. And I wish I had more questions because, okay, well, where does that leave Greg Valentine? Because in the 70s, they didn't do brother versus brother feuds, at least as far as I know. And number two, I mean, Johnny Valentine was feuding with Ric Flair, was teaming with Ric Flair, excuse me. So to answer Danny's question, Ric Flair may have ascended even faster if he's feuding with Johnny Valentine on top. Johnny was already older, but he, the fans still bought him. And like I said, they supposedly, that crash really turned history because Johnny Valentine was going to become the number one guy in that territory as a babyface.
Wow, that's some good insight. I didn't know that, and what you're saying makes a lot of sense. Had Flair gotten the rub from Valentine, it would have made his legend even bigger than it is now.
Yeah, and, obviously Ric Flair didn't need a lot of help. He was over like crazy in 1976 and would continue to be over like crazy for years to come. Getting a little bit off the 76 topic, Steve, I was watching some old World Championship Wrestling episodes from 1985, and Ric Flair gets out there and he says, I love doing this so much. I love being Ric Flair. I might do this for another 20 years. Well, he did it for a lot longer than that. It was just a great quote.
Well, he is a piece of work, but I've got another question for you, and this one is from Anthony Osiello. What was the wrestler in 1976 that you thought was destined for bigger things and fell short?
All right, my answer is absolutely crazy, okay? I now know how the WWF tag team scene worked, okay? I didn't know in 1976. I thought the wrestlers that were destined for bigger things were the Executioners. I mean, here you have these two giant guys who Lou Albano has put together as a tag team, and it looks like, they have other worlds to conquer once they left the WWF, and I could not understand for the life of me, like, what happened to them once they left the WWF? Because, again, I didn't know how the tag team scene worked or how the wrestling business worked.
Sure.
That the WWF would just create the Yukon Lumberjacks, the Moondogs, the Executioners, etc. So, yeah, I want to say years, but for at least a year, I would pick up the magazines waiting for the Executioners to show up in another territory, not realizing that Killer Kowalski, went home to Salem, Mass or whatever, and Executioner number 2 is now Big John Studd.
And I don't know, I don't even know if you would know this, but I did from my research. I was surprised to learn that Killer Kowalski actually spent some time in Florida in 1976. I think it was before the Executioner gimmick started, but it just shows you these guys are all over the place.
It really does. I had no idea he was still wrestling at all. I figured he hung it up in 1974 and came back a couple of years later to give one of his students a break.
Now, I'll try to answer that question too. There was one wrestler I remember reading about in the magazines back in the day. There was a wrestler in the AWA. His brother wrestled too, Billy Francis. And the wrestler I'm thinking about was Russ Francis, who ended up being an NFL tight end All-Pro with the San Francisco 49ers, Mr. Kippelman.
And the New England Patriots.
And the New England Patriots, too. So Russ, to me, he had it all. I mean, he was maybe in the NFL he was a big guy, but in wrestling I don't think he was really that big. But he had a great look, very athletic, and I could see why he never really became a big wrestling star. I mean, he came back for the WrestleMania 2 Battle Royal, but he was really a great NFL player, and I guess that's why he never really, even though his dad was the big promoter in Hawaii, he just never really took it to the next level.
That's an excellent answer because obviously Russ Francis, his football career wasn't going to last forever. So why not become a pro wrestler when that is all done? He was a big guy. He was a really good looking guy. So I like that answer. I didn't even think of that. I think it was 1976. The Patriots played the Dallas Cowboys, and the Cowboys had this linebacker, Hollywood Henderson, who was a total 70s guy and was running his mouth about what he was going to do to the Patriots. And our tight end, Russ Francis, who could block, just totally shut him down. God bless Russ. Thank you for that.
Man, your memories are right on target today. Unbelievable.
It was 76 or 77, 78, right around then, but I remember the game, and Russ Francis just turfed this guy.
Wow.
All right. I believe it's my question. I'm glad we're not going to get to all of them, but I'm glad we're getting to a lot of them. This is good.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see. I'm going to embarrass myself again. Carl Wardlaw asked, what was the thing about wrestling that grabbed your attention that first time and kept you watching? Steve, what was the one thing for you?
Well, I had seen wrestling before in 1976, very briefly. I'd seen the IWA, and I liked it as just kind of a goof. I mean, Monty Igor would, have these big cinder blocks on his shoulders, and his manager Ivan Kolmakov would hit him with a sledgehammer, and he would withstand all the pain and whatever, but it was just kind of corny. It was kind of ridiculous. But that first night I was watching WOR Channel 9 at midnight. It was Superstar and the Grand Wizard and Lou Albano and Ivan Koloff doing this promo with Vince for Madison Square Garden, and each one of these guys was riffing and just on the top of their game, and they were drawing you in. And then when they were all done, Vince has Bruno come out, and Bruno, I mean, he could have sold insurance. I mean, you really believe what this guy was talking about. He was just so honest and so sincere about, him helping to defend the honor of his fallen cousin, Tony Parisi. And I was just hooked from that moment on. I mean, the matches were fun and everything else, but just these larger than life characters, the ultra good guy Bruno and the ultra bad guy Superstar and Koloff and Albano and the Wizard and of course Blassie too. I was hooked. I was just hooked for life.
It's funny. We're very similar because the first time I saw wrestling was the last night I lived in Jackson Heights, New York. My parents went out and, one last night in New York, and one of my cousins was babysitting me, and he's like, okay, do you want to go to bed or do you want to watch wrestling? Well, what 10-year-old is going to say I want to go to bed, right? And I saw IWA wrestling. It was the first time I'd ever seen it, and they had Mighty Igor wrestling, and Bulldog Brower, a little different than Bruno Sammartino, comes out and starts beating up Mighty Igor with a chair. And it blew my mind. It absolutely blew my mind. Can you imagine Ken Norton and Muhammad Ali having a boxing match, and another boxer comes in, starts wailing on Ali with the chair? Can you imagine
I can't believe that.
Coming out and hitting Tom Seaver with a chair as he's, revving up to pitch. So, what a completely crazy different world. And then the next day, the Movers are at my house, and I start talking about this. Like, hey, are you going to see this match? And they're like, yeah, we're going in. And I'm talking, 10-year-old me is talking wrestling with the Movers, and my parents are like, what the hell is going on here, right?
Your babysitter got fired immediately.
My cousin got let go from the family. But that wasn't enough to hook me in, right? Just this thing I saw, and okay, wow. And then it was on Channel 56 at 11 in the morning, and I was a kid going through the channels. If it was on, I would watch it, and sometimes I'd turn it off, turn it on. I liked it, but I liked it as much as the cartoons and everything else. And one day, my favorite wrestler, Billy White Wolf, is taking a beat down from Rocky Tamayo and Crusher Blackwell. They knocked Jose Gonzalez out of the ring, and then the two guys were beating up the one guy. And Chief Jay Strongbow, who had been on hiatus from the WWF, comes running out, and the fans go crazy. And I mean crazy, like next level, something I've never seen before. And that was the moment I was hooked.
Wow.
And here I am 46 years later, whatever it is, 47 years later, talking about it on this thing called a podcast.
Yeah, and you and I can go apply for Medicare in a few years, so high five.
Lord willing. All right.
Willing.
So, all right. I think we've got time for one or two more questions.
Okay, I found a good one for us here. Mark Matuso asks, who was the wrestling MVP in 1976?
I think the wrestling MVP had to be, well, there's two possibilities. I'll go 1 and 1A. My 1A is Dusty Rhodes. Dusty Rhodes was on fire. He was wrestling not just in Florida, but he was wrestling in Atlanta. He was wrestling in the Carolinas. I know he took a booking for Fritz von Erich or two. The next year, he'd be up in the WWF making special appearances and wrestling superstar Billy Graham for the title. What am I talking about? Dusty is 1A. He just misses. My number one, I think it's going to be your number one. Well, the fact that Bruno Sammartino gets injured, and we have people out wondering whether or not the WWF was going to go out of business, speaks wonders for his value. The fact that Vince Sr. gave him a deal that was just phenomenal compared to what anyone else was making shows you how valuable Bruno Sammartino is. So, I mean, both in terms of real value and perceived value, like star power, being on the cover of magazines, I got to go with Bruno.
Oh, those are two great answers. I will tell you that one of my favorite wrestling historians is Steve Yohe, and a few years ago, he wrote this long article talking about, well, if the Wrestling Observer had been around back, say, in the 70s, like, who would the fans have written or voted for as the Wrestler of the Year? And this is what he had to say about 1976, and I'll keep this brief. He just says, this was the year of Antonio Inoki versus Muhammad Ali and Sammartino's broken neck. If Inoki had been able to pull it off, he would have won, but he didn't. Sammartino injured his neck in a match with young Stan Hansen and sucked it up to return and draw 40,000 for a rematch on the undercard of the closed circuit showing of Ali Inoki. Nowhere in the U.S. did the Ali match draw beans, so I feel the Shea Stadium can be credited to Bruno. He also drew big in matches with Billy Graham, Ernie Ladd, and Bruiser Brody. Terry Funk, Andre, Dusty Rhodes, Jumbo Tsuruta, Mil Mascaras, and Terry Funk would have some votes. Mid-Atlantic was having great matches with stars like Ric Flair and Wahoo McDaniel. So with the Steve Yohe as my witness, I'll vote for Bruno too.
Okay, and that makes sense. I've seen Steve's articles. I haven't seen them in a while, but I need to revisit those because I do remember them, and I do remember enjoying them. Let me see. Last question. I'll tell you what. Let me go with Vincent Waller. Was 1976 Andre the best version of Andre? If not, where do you rank his 1976 iteration? I'll tell you what, Steve. Please allow me to go first on this one. I will let you get in there. I mean, talk about like me being just so pedantic thinking about this question. I think 1976 Andre was probably the second best Andre. It was after he started to learn how to work and before he started to put on weight, which was noticeable as time went on, even before the broken leg with Killer Khan or whatever happened. 75, I thought, was the best Andre the Giant because he came to the WWF in 74. but they finally figured out, I want to say figured out how to use him. They kept him in the undercard, comedy matches, whatever else in 74. And then 75, you've got Andre versus Ernie Ladd starting off. That went into 76 as well, but they finally found the right opponent for Andre. You've got the Battle of the Giants with he and Ernie Ladd. So that's why I'm going with 1975. But Vincent, 1976 is my number 2. What do you think, Steve?
I think, aesthetically, I think Andre in 76 was maybe at his very best or his peak. But as a worker, I mean, just from watching his matches, when he did put on the extra weight and he wrestled Stan Hansen in 81 and he had the big series with Killer Khan in 81, the matches, I think, were more compelling then. It seemed like in 76, I know he wrestled Bockwinkel and he, had some real matches, outside of the WWWF. But it seemed like a lot of the time his matches were the ones that we saw were like mismatches. And by the time the 80s came, he was actually having good competitive matches with Hogan and Killer Khan and the guys we talked about, Stan Hansen in Japan. So even though aesthetically and health-wise he was a lot better in 76, I think his matches in 81 were probably even better than what he did in the 70s.
Okay, I can see that. I mean, the Killer Khan matches, even after the broken leg, you're right, were really good. He had a really good match with Stan Hansen in Japan. I think that was 83. So, I mean, you're making a really good point here. But like I said, aesthetically, I thought in 81, Andre, I mean, he was still Andre the Giant, but, for health reasons and other reasons, he started to get old quickly. And by 81, if you were there, Steve. I mean, Vince McMahon comes out and he announces what you're going to see on TV. And when he said, "And this week, Andre the Giant," I'd be like, "Oh God, again with that same old match." We always had.
I probably felt that way. I probably felt that way about it too, honestly.
All right, I can see that. All right, Steve, we have spoken for an hour about pro wrestling. If you're not into this next subject, I thank you for listening to the wrestling part, and I can't wait to see you next week. But Steve and I are going to have a little extra innings session where we talk about our favorite baseball players of the 1970s. Steve, I mean, you came up with this, and I wanted to roll with it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for taking me up on this. I just wanted to mention some players that just this is in no way saying, hey, these guys are the best players, but these were players I just remember fondly and have sweet memories of. First, I'm going to just give you some honorable mentions that didn't really make, we both made like a top 5, I think. But my honorable mentions would include Dave Kingman for his just unbelievable home run ability.
I got to see him. I got to see Dave Kingman hit a home run at his debut at Shea Stadium, opening day 74 or 75, whenever Kingman showed up with the Mets. I think it was 75.
Now tell me about that. Like, what did you think seeing this guy? He was huge.
He was huge. They got him for nothing. The Mets needed a first baseman. I mean, the guy on paper could play third, left, right, and first, but he could only really play first. And I was excited for him to be a Met. Obviously we're adding a quality player, and and then opening day, I got to see him jack a moonshot. So that was pretty exciting. I'm pretty sure that was 75.
Yeah, it's funny. We've been watching baseball all these years, and we've seen everything happen. We've seen Barry Bonds, we've seen Judge this year. We've seen really everything. But I mean, I still think about Dave Kingman when I think about home runs. I mean, he just had this magic about him. He was just such a powerhouse.
I mean, I don't have it in front of me, but I think he hit 36 home runs that year. At Shea, with Shea Stadium being his home stadium, it's like so hard to hit home runs at Shea. It was like the ultimate pitcher's park. That's thunder in the background, by the way, people.
Yeah, it was just a swirling wind of hot dog wrappers and garbage there. But I remember him playing in the 80s for the Cubs, and he would just like hit these. It was those games with the Phillies. It was like 18-11, and Kingman has hit 3 home runs today, folks. It was just unbelievable.
Yeah, he couldn't do anything but hit home runs, but he was good enough doing that where he was a valuable piece. I think his last year was 87, and he was still having a good year with the Oakland A's. Like, you're like, okay, why didn't this guy come back? But he didn't.
Yeah, I think him and Reggie were DHs right around that time. Now, another player I want to mention to you, and this is going to make you laugh because for those that don't know, John and I are rival fans here. He's a Red Sox fan. I'm a Yankee fan. And this guy was one of my all-time favorites, and he came from the Red Sox and probably one of the all-time worst trades for the Red Sox. We shipped him Danny Cater, and the Yankees got Sparky Lyle. And Sparky Lyle was kind of like the Mariano Rivera of the 70s, but instead of the cutter, it was the slider.
I mean, that trade took place, 73, and it still gets mentioned that, the Red Sox got fleeced by the Yankees.
Oh, yeah. And for fans who have read the Peter Gallenbach book, The Bronx Zoo, Sparky became famous for sitting on cakes. And that's something to be proud of.
I've got cake stories, but anyway, I don't have honorable mentions. I've got 5 guys. So who else do you have for honorable mention?
Just a couple. Willie Montanez, who played first base for the Mets a lot, he always liked to grab his junk before getting in the hitter's position. That was very bizarre to me as a young teenager watching the games.
Yeah, I could see that. This is going to sound weird to everyone. I recently took a look at Willie Montanez's stats at Baseball Reference, and I was like,
yeah,
okay, am I missing something? This guy kind of sucks. He no power, not a lot of walks, not a great batting average. Like, what's he doing in the lineup?
The way I remember him, he was more like a guy who would hit maybe around 300, but like you say, very little power. Not a guy that should probably be at first base, but I guess he couldn't play anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I remembered him fondly. I was like, oh yeah, Willie Montanez, 20 home runs a year, 90 RBIs, 290. No, none of that was there. I remember when the Mets traded for him though, and we lost John Matlack in the trade, and that was a real kick in the stomach.
Oh yeah, Matlack was a good pitcher. Now my final honorable mention, and maybe he should be number one on my regular list, but Rod Carew. I mean, baseball people write poems about it and they sing sonnets, and Rod Carew, just watching him swing a bat was like artistry, pure artistry. I mean, it was just magic watching him swing a bat.
Rod Carew might be the most underrated player of the 70s, one of the most underrated players of all time, which is kind of weird because he was a major star in baseball. If you were even a little bit of a baseball fan, you knew who Rod Carew was. And for whatever reason, probably because he played the bulk of his prime with the Twins, just doesn't get talked about a lot. But Rod Carew was one of the elite. Was he player of the 70s? No. My favorite player, who we will get to, was player of the 70s. But he might be in the top 5. He was that good. Give me Rod Carew over Reggie Jackson any day. And I thought Reggie Jackson was a great player.
Oh, right. Yeah, Reggie was a great money player for sure. Okay, now I'm going to my official top 5, and how I picked these. I'll just kind of mention why I picked them. Number 5, as a lifelong Yankee fan, I really never really followed the San Diego Padres, but it kind of caught my attention, or had some whimsy about this. The year that Randy Jones all of a sudden became the Cy Young out of left field. This guy with the poofy hair and the weird San Diego Padres jersey. Turned out he was one of the best junk ball pitchers of all time, and a lefty. But for a very brief time, from I think it was 76 or 77, he won a Cy Young, and he was considered one of the top pitchers in baseball, just as a junk ball pitcher.
Okay, Randy Jones, I want to say it was 76. I think he had 17 or 18 wins at the All-Star break.
Which is insane.
Right? It is insane. And
with a mediocre team, too.
With not, I don't even think they were mediocre. I thought San Diego was pretty bad at that point.
They probably had Dave Winfield and little else.
Winfield had arrived, yes. And there were people asking at the All-Star break, hey, are we going to see a pitcher win 30 games, which is just, I mean, in my lifetime, I think I've seen one guy win 25 games. Denny McLain won 31 games, but that was in the 60s and things were different. Right. So, and of course, he didn't win 30 games. And of course, the Mets traded a young player for a washed-up junk ball, Randy Jones, and gave him a nice contract because that's how the Mets did their business. But yeah, I remember that summer of Randy Jones, man.
Yeah, it was something to remember, especially for that franchise, which really had very few bright times over there. Now, what's your number 5?
Well, my number 5, before I want to say this about the Padres, when Catfish Hunter was granted free agency, which was incredible. No one got free agency in any sport back then, right?
That's right.
The Padres were willing to make him a far better financial offer than the Yankees did. And
really?
Catfish, oh, yeah. They were willing to give him more money and more years. And Catfish is like, I don't want to get involved in the San Diego Padres losing 90 games a year junk. I'll go play for the Yankees. But anyway, but yeah, Ray Kroc owned McDonald's, and he was ready to give Catfish whatever he wanted to get the Padres off the ground, and Catfish said no way. My number 5 favorite player of the 70s is someone I'll bet you've heard of, but very few others out there have. I loved this guy. He was a tiny little second baseman for the New York Mets. His name was Felix Millan. He had so little upper body strength that he choked up on the bat, for God's sake. But he could stop the ball all over the field. He was a great, not great, but he was a really good defensive second baseman. And, I just, as a Mets fan, I absolutely love the guy. I believe he is from the same hometown in Puerto Rico as our friend Jesus Salas Rodriguez. And like I said, Millan wasn't a great player, but he was a solid regular when he was with the Mets. I just love the guy.
No, he definitely was a very memorable part of those teams. And, it's funny about the heritage of the Mets. And I think Brian Last had mentioned this recently on one of the great Cornette shows. The new owner of the Mets is finally honoring the history and lineage of the Mets. And I remember they used to have, where the Yankees were famous for having a Bat Day and famous for having Old Timers Day. The Mets always liked to have, do you remember Banner Day?
Oh, of course.
And they'd have signs that would be like, bring back George Theodore, these big signs. It was just funny. I mean, long forgotten utility players, the fans wanted to bring him back. But those were the days of the Mets. And I actually went to the Shea Stadium in the mid-'70s for some of those games. And I remember going to they had this really cool restaurant where you can go and get you think I'd be eating a hot dog at the baseball game, but I got a whole Thanksgiving dinner in the Mets cafeteria, this big, hot turkey with the stuffing. It was incredibly good.
I was I talked about living a mile from Jack Ritchie's. I also lived a mile from Shea Stadium.
Really?
And which was really cool because in 1975, my last year in New York, the Yankees were playing 81 games at Shea Stadium too.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So I didn't realize how close I was. MapQuest is the thing I was looking for. I looked it up on MapQuest, another 1.3 miles. And you just get on the train and go to Shea Stadium. It had its own train stop and, boom, you're there right away. I was at the game where George Theodore, his career ended.
Really?
I'm totally serious. He got into this high-speed collision with Don Hahn. Neither one saw the other guy coming. They were going full speed. And George Theodore, he broke one hip and dislocated the other hip, right? So that was it for George Theodore. And for years, I was like, oh, man, it was so sad. We had this rising star, George Theodore, and look what happened. That's how the Mets made it sound like. And then finally, I'm old enough to know what's going on and look it up. I see the guy's 27 and he can't play. It's okay, the Mets lost this rising star. But, yeah, I was there live, and I'm very young. I'm like, why is this taking so long? Get him out of here. I didn't realize how serious these injuries were. Don Hahn, who was never that good, but he managed to play baseball again. But yeah, that was the end of George Theodore. And I got to see it live.
No, I can proudly say I remember using Don Hahn as a Stratomat card back in the mid '70s.
Oh, you didn't have a very good team, but anyway.
All right, my number 4. Now this is a guy. He's probably most famous for ending the Pete Rose hit streak, but Gene Garber, probably best known as a reliever for the Atlanta Braves. Back in the day, for people that might know me a little bit, I'm one of the all-time great wiffle ball players of my region where I'm from. And
I did not know that.
yeah, oh yeah. Actually, me and some buddies of mine were on a team that actually won. A Major League Baseball had sponsored this thing called Yard Ball in the year, I think it was either '99 or 2000, and we were like in our 40s or even then, or we're in 30s or 40s, and our team won. I didn't play in any of the games, but I was there, kind of an honorary, probably like a Bobby Heenan type, I guess. But our team won. But Gene Garber was always like an inspiration for me as a pitcher in wiffle ball. I did that real kind of like that weird motion, that underhanded turn your back to the batter and spin around and release the ball. And especially now that I'm turning into an old geezer, that windup is very comfortable. You don't have to throw it over the top. It's really a great windup he had.
I remember Gene Garber with the Braves and the Phillies. I remember him getting traded straight up for a guy named Dick Ruthven.
He was a good pitcher.
Was he? I don't remember. I remember him not being good, but I could be wrong. But yeah. I was like, I remember at the time, and maybe I was wrong, like, Garber's good, Ruthven's not. Why are we making this trade? Not we, because it was the Braves and the Phillies. I don't care, but that's what I remember about Garber. He was around for a while, though. I remember him in the mid-'80s.
Oh, yeah. I guess just that weird windup he had was so effective and very deceiving, since, it's probably hard for batters to pick up his release point, but he was just had a very good career.
All right. My number 4 through number 1 are nowhere near as abstract as my number 5. As a kid, I loved Johnny Bench. I mean, anytime the Reds came on, I got to see someone who was one of the best players in baseball. He was a Gold Glove catcher who would hit like 35, 40 home runs in the per year in not Veteran Stadium, whatever Riverfront Stadium where the Reds played.
Sure.
Pitchers Park in a pitchers league. Just they shared the stadium with the Cincinnati Bengals, which means that there's foul ground all over the place. And this guy, I mean, what a player he was. And plus, when I was a kid, I had this electronic game called Johnny Bench Baseball. So he gets the nod as number 4. No questions asked. Hall of Famer, easily one of the 5 best catchers of all time.
Yeah, he's a class act. He's always represented baseball so well, and now if you ever watch Cooperstown, and when they have all the old timers there, he's now one of the older ones, and he's such a great spokesman for the game. Now my number 3 was a guy that I never really got to see him play hardly at all, but I think just the legend of this guy, he just stands out to me as kind of an iconic player. Richie or Dick Allen, best known for the Phillies and also for the Chicago White Sox.
Now, we're talking favorite players here, right?
Well, yeah, but just players that I admire or like. Yeah, and I'm not saying best player, definitely not a best player, but for a short time, probably around 1972 with the White Sox, he was one of the top offensive players in baseball. But I liked his attitude. He was a very edgy guy. He wasn't going to take shit from anybody. And you don't see players like that anymore. You don't see a guy who just like no nonsense, ready to kick your ass. He was just a very well-respected ball player in that regard.
I mean, from what I understand about Dick Allen, by the time he was getting older, like in his 30s, he had turned into, he was like an Albert Bell type as far as like no one likes him, except Albert Bell, I never heard that he was a bad teammate. Dick Allen, there's so many stories about him just being a bad teammate and turning the younger players into also bad teammates. Supposedly, Carlos May would have been a way better player had he never been around Dick Allen. Supposedly Dick Allen was so toxic that even when he played really well, like 72, 73, 74, the guy killed it. But like he would do stuff like the day the White Sox were eliminated. Listen to this. The day the White Sox were eliminated from contention, he went home. Like, what the hell is that? To me, like, if a guy did that on my team, if I was the manager or the owner, he would never come back. I would trade him for nothing. If I was one of his teammates, I'd be like, you better get this guy off this fucking team. He's not coming back.
It sounds like the way you describe him. He was like, the Yankees had a player like that in the early 90s, Mel Hall, who played with the Cubs too. And he was really a cancer to the young guys like Bernie Williams. And when they dumped Mel Hall, that's when those young guys like Bernie Williams started to thrive and improve. So that's a good call on Dick Allen.
I remember Mel Hall and Joe Carter got traded straight up for Rick Sutcliffe from the Cubs. And I was like, wait a minute, these are like two elite prospects that you're giving up for like 1 year, I think it was. And Mel Hall, the first thing I saw with him was he had three batting gloves in his rear pocket of his uniform. And he was asked why. It's like, well, that way when I hit a home run, I can wave to everyone from every direction. And I'm like, can you take baseball a little bit seriously, please? You can't optimize your whatever running if you got these batting gloves hanging out. So that's another guy I was never crazy about.
This could have been the influence of wrestling on these guys. You never know. Could be.
My number 4 was John. Excuse me. Did you give us your number 3? I already said Johnny Bench. I'm sorry.
It was Gene Garber. So I'm up to Dick Allen was my number 3. So do you have a number 3?
I have a number 3, George Brett. I always loved George Brett. Had Ricky Henderson. Ricky Henderson was my favorite player to not play for the Red Sox until he played for the Red Sox. So George Brett is one of my favorite players to not play for the Red Sox. Just an intense player, was always there to win, no horsing around, great third baseman, great hitter. In a way, he's a little bit underrated because he played at the same time as Mike Schmidt, and Mike Schmidt was just better, sorry. But, I mean, Brett, no questions asked Hall of Famer, and a guy, even if he wasn't as good as he was, you want him on your team.
Oh, yeah. As a Yankee fan, he crushed my dreams so many times.
Oh, that's right.
He owned Goose Gossage. I mean, Gossage may have been able to throw it 100 miles an hour, but he launched it out 110 miles an hour, and he crushed us. And he, of course, played a major role in the infamous Pine Tar game, which will always be fondly remembered.
My favorite part of the Pine Tar game, which is 83, but we'll talk about it anyway, Billy Martin had that one up his sleeve for at least a year. He was waiting. He was waiting for the right moment, and he found it. And for those unaware, you can only have the Pine Tar on the bat the length of home plate. If you have it any higher, you're disqualified. Whatever you did just gets thrown out. Well, George Brett hits a big home run, and Billy Martin comes out and says, "Let's see that bat." And they called George Brett out after he hit a home run. And George Brett, if you haven't seen it, you must see it on YouTube. Talk about a guy snapping. And you know what? I'm not a Yankees fan, but they restarted the game, and that's wrong. It was it was the rule, and George Brett was breaking the rule, and, you're out, George. Sorry. I don't know why baseball ruled the way it did.
Yeah. And it's funny that back in those days, you had managers like a Billy Martin who knew all the rules and knew how to take advantage of them, and guys like Earl Weaver. I mean, tons of great managers back in the day. That's one thing that is so missing in today's baseball. You rarely see a manager have such impact on the outcomes of the games.
I am convinced the difference between the 70s Red Sox and the 70s Yankees was Billy Martin. He is the top reason why the Yankees won championships, because he was not going to settle for anything else. His attitude was, we're the big bad New York Yankees, and we're coming here to kick your ass. The Red Sox are like, yeah, we're here to play baseball and collect a paycheck. It's true.
I'm grateful for what happened, because those championships, especially the '78 one, was well, enough said. But my number 2 I have is Thurman Munson, who was probably my first favorite baseball player going back to the 70s. He always left it all on the field, gave 100% at all times. Tying it in with wrestling, I remember being at the mall and seeing the first ever issue of Pro Wrestling Illustrated and buying it at this little magazine kiosk at our mall. So we're driving home and I'm reading this magazine and the radio is blaring AM radio or FM radio, and they announced that Thurman Munson had passed away in a plane crash. And man, wow, our lives were never the same after that.
I also remember buying the first issue of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. I took my bike to Plainville, Massachusetts on a really hot day, and I was happy that I had enough money to buy a Gatorade. I remember hearing about Thurman Munson's death, and, I don't know what's going on. Like, did the Yankees plane crash? What the hell? And no, I found out what happened, that he's, flying back and forth from New York to Akron, and, it wasn't supposedly he was fooling around a little bit with that airplane, and unfortunately the result was what it was. I mean, I wish we lived in a world where that didn't happen and we got to see the rest of Thurman Munson's career play out.
Yeah, I really think that as a player, I don't think he had a lot of left in the tank, but he was a hell of a guy and was sorely missed. Did we give your number 2 yet?
No, not yet. But I remember when the Yankees first signed Reggie Jackson. And by the way, the guy they really wanted was Bobby Grich, and Bobby Grich was not going to New York. Thurman Munson gets to New York, Reggie Jackson, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to lead this team." Thurman Munson's the captain, but I know how to stir the drink. Thurman can only stir it bad. You just got here, bro. What are you doing?
Yeah, they definitely got off on the wrong foot, and it really alienated the other Yankees from Reggie. I think the only Yankee that ever sat with Reggie was Fran Healy, the backup catcher. They formed an alliance, but the rest of the Yankees, like Piniella and Nettles, they hated Reggie. But I definitely, when they were in those championship games with the Royals and with the Dodgers, Reggie and Thurman came together for the great results they ended up with.
Winning goes a long way. I remember when they had the Reggie Jackson candy bar. This is how big Reggie Jackson was. And Sparky Lyle's like, it's the only candy bar you open it up and it tells you how good it is.
I was there opening day of, I think it was 78, and they were throwing those on the field at Yankee Stadium.
I remember that.
Yeah, I was there. Wilbur Wood was pitching for the White Sox, and I don't think Reggie may have hit a home run that day, but man, those bars were all over the field. It was insanity.
Welcome to the 70s. Steve, I miss the days because we really don't have any baseball players like that anymore. We don't have, there are great baseball players, but there are no Reggie Jacksons who are household names. There are no Pete Roses, etc. that just, everyone knows who this guy is. I miss that. I mean, look, think about how great Mike Trout has been. And
unbelievable, yes.
And if I stood up and read, hey, who's Mike Trout? 90% of the people aren't going to know who he is. Everyone knew who Reggie was.
Oh yeah, him and Bryce Harper, now Aaron Judge. I mean, there's a handful, but they should have their own candy bars, from my point of view.
Well, that's the thing. It's like there's no demand for a Bryce Harper candy bar. There was for Reggie. It's just baseball and the world has changed. But my number 2 is, no questions asked, the greatest New York Met of all time, Tom Seaver. Put him out there every 5th day, and even the lowly Mets have an excellent chance of winning. Steve, I was lucky enough to see Tom Seaver versus Bob Gibson at Shea Stadium. So
unbelievable. Wow.
Yeah. That was a big one. I mean, I had Tom Seaver posters. I had my Mets hat. He was my guy growing up.
Well, in tying in with our earlier theme from 1976, to see Tom Seaver host that Greatest Sports Legends with Bruno, that was off the chain.
It was something you were not expecting to see. I believe that came out in 79.
Yeah.
But I mean, talk about, just the top guys in two separate worlds. And yeah, I remember getting the paper like the day the Mets traded Tom Seaver. Of course, the Mets being the Mets, trade $1 for a couple of nickels and 3 pennies. And it was a very, very sad day. Same day Kingman left.
Oh yeah, that was a real fire sale, and there is if you do a Google search, there's a picture of Pat Zachary, who I think became the de facto ace of the Mets after that trade, with him and Ken Patera at Shea Stadium from the big Showdown at Shea show.
And Zachary was not wearing a shirt, and this is before baseball players got serious about their muscularity. And it's a hilarious picture. You got scrawny little Pat Zachary and Ken Patera, who looks like he's about to explode.
Yeah, they do look like father and son. But my favorite player to end.
I'm surprised it's not Thurman Munson. I thought for sure Thurman Munson would be your number one.
Well, it ties in kind of my favorite player because he really transitioned from the era before I was born, even the Mickey Mantle era, and he transitioned all the way to the beginning of the Don Mattingly era. Would be Bobby Mercer. He was an All-American Yankee legend and icon, and he came up when Mantle was finishing up, and by the time that Mercer hung it up, he was basically just a DH pinch hitter type in 82, 83. Mattingly, I believe, replaced him, and so he's kind of a link to those two Yankee icons.
Well, to this day, it is difficult for me not to call him Bobby Moisa, because that's what everyone in Jackson Heights called him.
Bobby Moisa.
Yeah. And I remember he got traded for Bobby Bonds, and just everyone was devastated. Like, Bobby Mercer's gone. And I'm a kid. I'm like, but Bobby Bonds is the better player.
He had a great 75 for the Yankees, Bobby Bonds. And I guess for us diehard Yankee fans, I think Bobby Bonds is probably best remembered because we traded him to the Angels and we got Mickey Rivers and Ed Figueroa back, which,
that's right.
As you well know, they both played a major role in the 2 Yankee championships that followed and 3 pennants. So they never would have gone anywhere without being able to trade Bobby Bonds. But and poor, I don't know if Lou was probably 4 years old when this all happened, but Mercer floundered in the Candlestick Park, and then he went to the Cubs and floundered there. And when he came back to the Yankees in 79, just a few months before Thurman's death, he was, kind of a platoon player, but he still put up some good numbers. And surprisingly, Mercer is in the top 10 of the 70s for base hits, I guess, in the 70s. So, well-regarded player.
No, yeah, and you're right. I forgot for a minute that they flipped Mercer for Bonds, and then they flipped Bonds for Rivers and Figueroa. I mean, Figueroa was as solid at number 2 as you're going to see, and Mickey Rivers, at least one season, was definitely in the conversation for MVP. So, I mean, an absolute theft by the Yankees.
Yeah, I've been telling all my friends who've been on the, jumping off the Yankee parachute or jumping off the Yankees bandwagon, that this Harrison Bader that they acquired is going to be the next Mickey Rivers, but with a lot more power. So we'll see how that goes.
All right. My favorite player in the 70s, and it's not even close. No, he was not a New York Mets. No, he was not on the Boston Red Sox. But everyone imitated his batting style, the chicken wing. Greatest defensive second baseman of all time, an offensive dynamo, absolutely deserved more MVPs than he got. Joe Morgan. I mean, just such an exciting player. Both defensively and offensively. He was someone, the Reds were on TV all the time back then, and you stopped what you were doing when Joe Morgan stepped up to the plate. I mean, what a greatest second baseman of all time. And he lasted into his 40s. Like, it's 1984, and I'm like, okay, Joe Morgan's still out there with the A's or the Phillies, whatever, and he was still good.
Oh
So
yeah, he was so good in his second career on the Sunday Night Baseball Game of the Week with our friend from San Francisco. There, he was great in that too. He was like the ultimate spokesman for baseball in that position. And you're absolutely right. What a great Hall of Fame second baseman he was.
And like I say, he was my favorite player. He was so exciting. He was diminutive, yet he still had all kinds of power. He would hit 20 home runs a year, again in a pitcher's era, walked 100 times a year, stole like 60 bases. I mean, he was, a player, if you had to build a player out of a warehouse or whatever, like this is the player you would build. Maybe a little bit bigger, but then again, if he was bigger, maybe he wouldn't have been what he was.
Well, now that we've gone through our favorite players from the 70s, why don't we end the show by can you make us a prediction for what do you think is going to happen in the postseason?
Well, and there's one other thing I want to talk about too. The postseason, I mean, right now, I on the 605 baseball special, I took the Chicago White Sox winning the World Series. It's not looking real good right now. I figured that would be an easy division to win, and that's what counts. And it's been anything but. Minnesota has had a good year. Cleveland has had a really good year. I mean, ultimately, I have to go with the Dodgers. I mean, the Dodgers, not only are they an all-star team, but they've got guys on the bench or coming off the bench, coming out of the bullpen, who are fantastic. I mean, they've got to be the favorites right now. If I had to pick a team from the American League, I think I'd go with the Yankees over the Astros. But one thing that makes the Major League postseason so much fun is it's unpredictable. A team that wins 62% of its games isn't going to be strongly favored over a team that wins 59%, and that's what it comes down to.
It's going to be interesting to see with the, I wasn't a really huge fan of the extra round or extra teams in the playoffs, but it'll be interesting to see with say if Seattle gets in and Tampa and Toronto. It'll be interesting to see if maybe an obscure team can somehow make it get through, or will it just be the predictable, those teams will just do the job for these better known front runners.
Well, we shall see. There's really no such thing as an upset in baseball. One last thing, Aaron Judge, no questions asked, the best and most exciting player of 2022 is going to be a free agent, and that is right around the corner. That's 10 weeks away. Follow me on Twitter because you get to see stuff like this. Some guy is like, oh yeah, Aaron Judge should take 5 years, $250 million from the Yankees. And I'm like, dude, he is not taking 5 years. He's not getting paid through his 36th birthday. That is not the market. I'm thinking he gets bare minimum 8 years, but wait, I'm thinking more like 10 because, again, that's the market, and he is going to be the hottest free agent in a long time. I think we're going to see Aaron. It only takes one team to go crazy, and I think one team is going to go maybe 9 years, $400 million on this guy.
Well, I follow your Twitter, John, and it was so funny the other day. The guy that you were talking to about this, I don't know if you would remember the name, but the guy's name is Mike Kalinich. He's one of those wiffle ball players I grew up with.
That's funny.
Yeah, I mean, just go figure. I mean, in this huge world, here we are talking here, but.
One thing, Steve, it was a respectful exchange too. It wasn't like Twitter, you're stupid, you're an asshole. It's like, okay, we just disagreed on it, but that's as far as it went.
Yeah, you were two smart fans and discussing it very intelligently. But as a Yankee fan, I'd like to see him get what he deserves. I know. I remember when your guy Mookie Betts was kind of going through the same decision, and I know you were. I think at the time you were wanting the Red Sox to kind of part ways with him just because you felt the price wasn't right and the length wasn't right. I mean, I'm hoping the Yankees can retain him because, let's say the Yankees flop again this year like they've done so much in recent years. And let's say that the Mets, because the Mets owner has got more money than anybody else, and he's a very generous guy. If he gives Judge what he's looking for and outbids the Yankees, and he goes to play for the Mets. I mean, we're never going to hear the end of it. And plus, the Mets, who are already a very good team, are going to have, arguably the best player in baseball on their team. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
You'll hear the end of it when that contract turns into an Albert Pujols contract. I mean, Judge is a great athlete, okay? He can play center field. So even if he declines in the field, okay, shove him over to left, right? So that part's good. But he's 6'7", and he's like, what, 285?
Yeah.
Baseball players like that tend not to age well.
Right.
And someone asked Aaron Judge, hey, would you be interested in going to Boston? He's like, well, they have great fans there. Well, of course, everyone's like, oh my God, we're getting Aaron Judge. I'd rather pass, or at least based on what I think he's going to get, I would rather the Red Sox pass. I don't want to be paying Aaron Judge, $45, $50 million a year when he's 39 years old. Sorry.
All right, and I'll end this conversation with what I've been saying the entire year, and this is the unpopular hot take of the year. The Yankees screwed themselves royally when they dumped Joey Gallo. I don't care if he's batting 160. He should be in the friggin' lineup. He should be in left field, catching balls. He should be on the team.
All right, I disagree with you. I think Joey Gallo needed a change of scenery. I mean, you can't have a left fielder who's an automatic out there. And yeah, I get that the guy has some talent, but his particular skill set indicates that he's going to be done with baseball quickly. And I like the guy. I hope he turns it around, but I don't think the Yankees made a mistake. But with that, Steve, thank you for being on Stick to Wrestling. You were great with the wrestling part. You were great with the extra innings part.
Hey, John, it's like old times. It's just great to do it with you. Hopefully we'll do it again in 6 or 7 years.
Years, okay. I don't think Stick to Wrestling is going to be around 6 or 7 years from now.
No.
You never know. But yeah, thank you, Steve, for being on. I want to thank Brian Last for giving me this forum. I want to thank Lou Kippelman for all the great work he does. He really does wonderful work with the audio. And I want to thank everyone for listening. I look forward to doing this again next week. This has been a production of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network. Go Vols, beat Florida.
This concludes our podcast day.